There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. It's so good to see folks. My name is Dr. Matthew Camp. I am Director of Government Relations at Teachers College at Columbia University and Adjunct Assistant Professor at NYU Wagner's Graduate School of Public Service, where I teach Political Action and Advocacy Capstone course. Today, we have a really exciting run of show. We have, I'm going to open it up with sharing my screen. Encourage folks to turn on their cameras if possible. Love to see you. And here is the beginning. So I want to open up honoring the Haudenosaunee Nations of upstate New York and their tradition of giving thanks first, called the word spoken before all others. So gratitude. So much gratitude today to you, the participants, to our facilitators who are joined on the screen. You can see them highlighted, and to all the individuals at NYU and Teachers College who helped make today's event possible. So a quick overview of what we'll do today. Right now, we're in our intro, and I'm joined by Joey Yui. Hi, Joey. I'll just unmute.
Hi, Matt. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me today.
Absolutely. And in a few minutes, Mayor Eric Adams will be joining us for welcoming remarks. We'll shift over to Reverend Qalvy Grainzvolt. Hi, Reverend, who will go walk us through a guided meditation. And then we'll take a break. It's very important to have a restorative practice, to pull back from all this effort, take a screen break, take a bio break, take a screen break. If you want to scream, that's great too. Then we'll shift over to Activism and Traditional Wisdom, Activism and Wisdom Traditions workshop with Raaghav and Chris, who are TC Doc students. Hi, hi, hi. And we will shift over to Cultivating Beloved Community, Robert Taylor Jr. from NYU's Mindful Community in the tradition of Martin Luther King Jr. And then we'll close up with me and Joey. So I want to make an offering, or you could consider it community guidelines, just some thoughts to kick things off on being present. So being yourself, bring your whole self here. Whatever that means for you. I know for me, it means closing up all my other tabs on my computer screen, putting my phone down out of my peripheral vision, sitting up straight for me works, and taking a deep breath. So they say 90% of life is just showing up, and I think 90% or maybe more of advocacy is showing up and bringing your whole self to the situation. So we could be better listeners, better making the right decisions at the right time. Listening, so important. Listening with a curious mind, being open to surprise, I think is really the essence of learning. And thinking about mindfulness as foundational, not as an add-on. We hear a lot about mindfulness these days as maybe a respite or a way of getting away from the world. And I tend to think of mindfulness as a refuge in reality, with reality. So definitely not gonna be so bold as to define mindfulness. We'll do that together later. I wanna tell a quick story about paradox. And we hear a lot about paradox and mindfulness, especially in Japanese Zen koan traditions. And so for me, you hear a lot about resilience. It's in the title of our workshop. You hear a lot about vulnerability, if you watch TED Talks, and I'm like, which one is it? If the TED Talks can't tell us what it is, we're all doomed. So we hear this tension between resilience and vulnerability. For me, I experienced a lot of vulnerability in my first yoga class. I didn't really know what the moves were. I was, the clothes were, I'm in my shorts, and I'm like, am I doing it right? The asanas, the poses were strange sounding to me. Am I the only guy in this room? Just a lot of questions and discomfort. And it wasn't until I did this asana, this pose called standing splits, that I really understood how to be simultaneously vulnerable and resilient. And that pose is where kind of on one leg and folding forward and up, I'll just show you, and lifting the other leg up in the air. I hope you could hear me, but basically doing this, exhaling and grabbing onto the ankle, Achilles tendon, and I felt all these muscles moving, these tendons, and it blew me away, because a lot of times we hear and see pictures of yogis, and they're on Instagram and they look like these statuesque people, and they look like they're totally motionless, you know, or a meditating statue. And the reality is like actually moving. And fast forward 5 years, I'm in yoga teacher training because I got the bug, and reading the Bhagavad Gita, you know, ancient Hindu text. And the essence of that has a lot to do with all is action. Things never stop moving. And so for me, there's kind of that lesson for an advocate to not maybe get attached to our wins, our losses, and so on, and thinking that there's always more to come. Legislation is a living, breathing thing. So I just show this picture of a tree. This happens to be the London plane tree, very common in New York City. And this tree just represents this paradox, this amazing kind of resilience and vulnerability. The bark is always looking like it's peeling off. The limbs will just drop in a heavy wind. But the tree is surviving. The tree is reaching upward as it's rooting downward. It's really just beautiful. And sometimes the answers are just right in front of us. I want to ask this question about how can mindfulness drive advocacy? Because we've sold this event, we build this event as an exploration. And my initial response is something you don't hear very much in academia. It's actually considered a liability to say this. And I actually got in trouble in a meeting once for saying this, and that is, I don't know. And to admit that we don't know something is, you know, takes, I think, some vulnerability. And again, a tradition going back in Korean Zen, this concept of don't know mind. And you might hear about don't know mind, you might hear about beginner's mind. So that might be a way of kicking things off. And I want to kick it off, crowdsource this question with you all. So Joey, if you could drop in the chat, we've got a Padlet, which is basically a Google Jamboard. Check it out, and I'm gonna click it right now. Can you see that screen? And so there are a couple questions here. What mindfulness practices do you do?
Matt, we can't see it.
Okay, thanks for that. It should, if you click that link, you'll get it, but I will fire it up right now. Let me just. So there are 3 questions. What mindfulness practices do you do? And then the second is, what advocacy issues do you care about? And then the third is, how do you think those practices can drive your advocacy? So I'll just zip up for a minute or two as you kind of co-explore that. We ask that you do put your name on your comment. If you do sign into Padlet, your name automatically comes up. That's another step, up to you. But yes, so we could kind of do this together. So take it away, participants. So for me, you know, I talked about just meditating, just sitting, and how listening becomes a tool there. And listening to me is helpful to, you know, hear the voices and uplift, and here we go. So we have Erica and Roger. Thank you for sharing meditation and yoga, and another person, Regina, for carefully listening, research, and hiking. So many good, they're just a myriad. This is what we're going to see live, the myriad of mindful practices out there. Walking. And when you do get to number 3, feel free to borrow from your co-participants and say, hey, look, you know, I don't do walking meditation like I think Virginia does, but maybe that would be a way of, you know, doing a silent protest, you know, walking around the UN or something like this if you care about climate justice, like Chris Torres does. So try and keep those posts below the question headers if that's possible. Equity in school funding. again, please do put your name next to it so we can co-create together. So Rudy will look for the mayor as he's entering the area. It looks like he's in under Angel Chang's name. Okay, thank you, Rudy, you got it. Okay, so keep that going. That's for you to explore throughout the day. We do have a very special guest joining us right now. I'm going to stop share just so we can focus here. There we go. And he is the 110th mayor of the city of New York. He is in, I think, his 100th day in office, and has been borough president of Brooklyn and a state senator and a New York City police captain. I want to thank the mayor personally and his staff for their grace. From a personal story, I interviewed then Borough President Adams for my independent newsletter called Civic List a couple years ago, and I just messed up the date. I flubbed it, totally on me. They rescheduled without any questions asked. I thought that was very gracious and something all leaders, I take note of, and other people can too. I don't know if it was due to numerical dyslexia that I sometimes have. I know the mayor has had dyslexia or whatever, but it doesn't matter. They just showed a lot of grace in that moment. Mr. Mayor, over the past few minutes, we've been kind of exploring who's in the room, and we've got graduate students from Teachers College at Columbia who care about climate and a culture of respect and academia, equity in school funding. I've heard from folks caring about homelessness in New York, AAPI issues, and more. And we've got folks from NYU Wagner, graduate students in public service. And so when we've got just a whole variety of folks and issues they care about, and when we kind of set this up, Mr. Mayor, I thought of another really well-known New Yorker, Walt Whitman, who talked about the complexities of New York himself as a metaphor for that, with contradictions and being full of the multitudes. And so, we've got a multitude of people and concerns here today. And I wonder, my question for you is, how does mindfulness help you as a leader, especially when leadership requires listening and responding to a multitude of people, especially those who don't have political power and are often unheard? Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thanks so much, Matthew, and really thank all of you for taking out a moment that I wanted to just share with you for a few moments on, where I am with mindfulness, meditation, breathing, and a combination of things. One, I have learned to speak like I know and listen like I don't know. That is a quote I heard, and I thought it was a powerful quote. And when I look at what's happening in the city, and just not to make it political, but to be honest, a lot of the anger I saw came out of the former president in office. Our country has become so severely divided. And I knew after his second year, I was no longer concerned about him because I thought we would rise up and eventually elect him out. But I was concerned about who we are as human beings across the entire globe in general, but specifically in New York. We don't talk to each other anymore. We wait to hear the end of a sentence so we can prove how wrong we are. We've learned to yell and scream. We don't sit down among family gatherings without getting into heated debates. No one wants the joy of learning and evolving on their positions. I've evolved so much from things that I thought I knew that I didn't know, because all that we have to know is not all there is to know. And mindfulness and breathing and meditation has allowed me to do that. I just strongly believe, after coming over my late stage of diabetes and vision loss and seeing how much the body can heal, I knew that if the body can heal physically, it can heal mentally. And there is just so much pain right now, And I've learned through mindfulness to separate what people are saying and really dig into what they are feeling. Far too many people, within the first few sentences, you can realize that what they are sharing has little or nothing to do with you. It has to do with what they are feeling internally. And so we must introduce this self-care into our school system. It shocked me when I sit down during one of my breathing exercises, and I realized that I was never taught how to communicate. From public school to middle school to college, I don't recall one course that taught me the art of communication, a skill that is so crucial. And we don't teach it. And depending on what community you are in, if you're in a community of just pure survival, you don't receive those self-care skills. We want to change that. I send teachers away as board president to learn the art of yoga, meditation, and mindfulness so they can teach their colleagues. And we want to introduce this into our entire school system. We're partnering with Goldie Hawn, who has an excellent curriculum called Brain Breaks, because we also have to get over the connotation that is attached with the word meditation. And sometimes we have to meet people where they are and not where we are in order to take them where they ought to be. And so we are open to partnering with you and others that understand there needs to be a real healing in our city. And I think it cascades throughout the entire country. And it starts with self-care. How do we take care of ourselves? Being academically smart is one thing, but being emotionally intelligent is what we should be pursuing right now, and developing the full personhood of our young people so we can stop dealing with the pain that many of them are experiencing.
That's really amazing, powerful words. Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor, for sharing those insights. I know you've got a lot to do on your agenda and never stop working. So just wanted to thank you for sharing that and inspiring us today and kicking things off. So many, many thanks to you.
Thank you. Take care.
Have a good day. Pretty amazing. I'm just going to give that a minute to kind of marinate for us. So now we are right on schedule. We've got our first workshop on a guided meditation, a grounding meditation with Reverend Qalvy Grainzvolt. And again, if you are able to turn camera on, that would be great to see your beautiful faces. And Reverend Grainzvolt, I do have a slide for you. You should have slide sharing abilities, but just let me know if you want to share that or if you want to kick it off.
If you have it handy, Dr. Camp.
You got it.
And thank you so much.
Sure
Just
thing.
to be mindful of everyone's very precious time.
There you are.
Okay, great. So yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. My name is Qalvy. It's not a compassionate name. It's actually quite difficult. It doesn't follow the conventions of English. So my apologies for that. I actually wanted to sort of piggyback off of this really beautiful comment that Mayor Adams gave, and also how Dr. Camp sort of started this off as an exploration. So the image to start this brief period of meditation off in a multi-sensory way. This is actually in Brooklyn, and taken by a good friend of mine, retired police chief Joseph Fox, who was the Transit Bureau chief until 2018, as part of his contemplative mindful walks. And really quickly, before we go into the meditation, seeing something over and over again, the repetition that is part of life in many ways, is sort of how I wanted to introduce this today, if you would indulge me. Not in Brooklyn, but in Midtown Manhattan, where my Buddhist Shinyo Buddhist Center is and meditation center is. I walk past the New York City Public Library, and there are brass plaques embedded in the sidewalk about a block away. Walking on this certain block, I think it was 41st Street or 40th, if I'm not mistaken, there is a quote by the poet Muriel Rukeyser, and I've seen it again and again and again as I've walked over it. And it says simply this: the universe is made of stories, not atoms. Now, I read that once and it sort of touched my heart. And when I walk over it again, it sort of percolates through another way. And so when I see all the human beings here, all the beautiful faces, all the beautiful lives that are here, we all have stories. And in that context, I wanted to sort of explore mindfulness today, that we all have a story, that we live in an interdependent world, and that our stories are intertwined with others. So we are our own protagonists, but ultimately we are driven by a community-oriented dynamic. So with that, to the extent you feel comfortable, I invite you to gently close your eyes. If for whatever reason that is uncomfortable to you, you're welcome to look at this image or anything else that you find grounding or centering. And the invitation to you is to notice your body settling in to your physical spaces, maybe even noticing the climate of the room or the spaces that you're in. And then meeting ourselves each at our own authentic paces, taking 3 opening breaths. And that is simply breathing in, inhaling, and then exhaling as naturally as you can in triplicate. And as we step a little bit further into this guided meditation, you will immediately recognize that your own breathing has a story. Involuntarily, you entered a 4th, a 5th, and many subsequent breaths after those first 3. And that this meditation, your lives, and the narratives and stories that you hold are part of a continuum. And so how precious it is that each and every one of you here has taken this time, somehow carved out of your schedules today to explore who you are as the protagonist, as the main character in your own stories. And then perhaps after this meditation, seeing how you fit into this world with a mindful orientation. I would invite you now, as you continue keeping the eyes gently closed, if that's comfortable to you, breathing as naturally as you can, in and then out, to take the next roughly 2 minutes, almost imagining that your mind, your inner space, this inner landscape, your thoughts are a little bit as though you are watching this seascape, and that your thoughts, like birds, like clouds, like waves rolling by, you can simply observe and see what they are. And should you notice any judgment arising, seeing if you can exhale it out and let go of that which you do not need, including that judgment. Whether you know it or not, as you're sitting here, exploring this inner, vast, infinite space, sometimes it can be a little bit isolating, or it might feel lonely to sort of explore within. But what if we consider that you're not alone at this moment? That in fact, you are showing up and you are surrounded by these beautiful inner resources: openness, courage, be present oriented, to notice your thoughts, if any at all, maybe some degree of exertion and effort, maybe acceptance. If we really sort of zoom out the camera lens of the consciousness and recognize, wow, we're not alone. And as we do this exploration, we're surrounded by all the other folks who showed up and made this time. So my next invitation to you as you continue, if it feels comfortable, keeping the eyes gently closed. If not, being centered on something that does allow you with the eyes open. Again, continuing to breathe as authentically and as naturally as you can. And perhaps now we can start to bring our focus and attention to two very sort of distinct landmarks, if you will. The first being stillness, and the second being silence. I'm just going to take the next minute or so to kind of meet who we are when we slow down enough to notice some degree of stillness. We're not looking for a binary of absolute stillness or movement. We're looking for a slowing down. So wherever you might attend to stillness in the body, you could start there. If you find it helpful, perhaps noticing the feeling of your clothing on the skin. Noticing its weight, its breathability, going to a very granular space of its texture, its fabric. Seeing if you can notice how that feels on your skin. And in so doing, getting a little bit closer to noticing any stillness that adorns the body, as though stillness is an article of clothing too. We'll take that minute starting now. And as you're continuing, even just to make this effort, perhaps the mind has wandered, it has drifted around. Whatever the case, with a heart of acceptance, openness, I invite you to continue noticing and attending to stillness, however you might, but now bringing your attention and focus to any silence that you might glean from your environments, and more importantly, from within. How might we do that? If we come back to the notion that there is a story, and that the universe is made up of stories, not atoms, then I invite you to pay attention to the story of your breathing. And in fact, choose a sound that is so faint, like your breathing, that it requires your full attention to hear it. And in so doing, perhaps we get a little bit closer to silence as we take this next minute to listen to whatever sound you can discern from each in-breath as it flows in, and each out-breath as you exhale and let it go. And so you've been taking this time authentically, making an effort, at the very least attempting to slow things down a little bit, and to meet who you are as the main character in your own narratives. When you're not multitasking, when you are simply trying to be present with who you are at the core, not being defined by what you're doing at this moment, but more so by who you already are. And so perhaps in some ways, we might explore this idea that meditation is not only about cultivating something, not about adding something on, but rather parting some of the clouds that obfuscate our views of who we already are and what unique passion and what uniqueness we hold in the heart and mind. So then perhaps we've come to this meditation today, not so much to realize something, but to slow things down and to be reminded about something that's already there. What I would invite you to do now is to turn to the body, perhaps opening up this definition of mindfulness as a whole body enterprise. And as we do this body sensing technique, the simple goal is to be as present as you can with each physical sensation as we visit with those altitudes of the body. So for example, we begin in the head space, and for the next maybe half minute or so, to become keenly aware of the sensation of breathing in and then out, as though this is your most important work. If you'd like, I invite you to try that now. And then if you can, Invite gravity. Be accompanied by gravity. Take your focus, your attention, your awareness away from the headspace. Let it descend with gravity now into the area of the chest, the heart, and the lungs. And begin noticing any subtle rise and fall, almost like the waves of the ocean, rolling in and out. Noticing that sensation in the area of the chest. If you find it helpful, you're welcome to place the palm of your hand, feel that on the chest in a more tactile way. If you're comfortable as you are, then there is no need to change a thing. And then again, trusting gravity, letting your attention, your focus, your arms, hands relax. We want to now bring the meditation or our focus even farther away from the headspace. So now down past the heart and the lungs, down through the core of the body, seeing if you can bring all of your focus toward the very base of your lower abdomen. As you shift your focus there, almost imagining or sensing your headspace becoming lighter, freer, and more open. And then as you begin tuning into the sensation, the motion of a rise and fall in the lower abdomen that corresponds to your breathing, seeing if you can ground yourselves there, almost discerning your center of gravity and the balance and stability that naturally resides there. If you're in a seated posture, and if you find this helpful, you're welcome to straighten the spine for a short period of time, but making sure to relax the neck, shoulders, and the upper carriage of the body as you continue to breathe naturally in and then out. And if you're still here, you're still present, you're still trying, maybe just take a moment before sort of get to the last part of this meditation to acknowledge what an incredible feat, an incredible accomplishment it is to just be here and try. To be open, to be accepting, to be surrounded by all these beautiful inner resources that you have sort of awakened from this inner reservoir of mind, body, and heart. I would invite you lastly to once more harmonize with gravity and bring your focus now to whatever surface has been giving your body, your physical body, support, foundation, uplift. For the duration of this meditation so far. It's a chair, couch, floor, maybe you're standing. Something is giving your body foundation. See if you can notice how that feels. In other words, you're paying attention to the story narrative of this present moment that you are, maybe many of you, quite literally sitting in. Continue to breathe naturally in and out as you do so. We might consider that any story has a beginning, middle, perhaps an end, usually. And to the extent that this meditation is a narrative, I did say it's part of a continuum. Perhaps there is no sort of end in sight. And maybe this meditation wasn't about like walking a few city blocks to get from point A to B. But if there is a destination, maybe this is one of them. Everything we've done, slowing things down, focusing on stillness, on silence, doing this body scan, noticing the foundation of the moment that you're in, maybe brings us to this contemplation now. As viscerally as you can feel whatever surface is giving your body support and foundation and uplift, see who or what comes to mind when you consider who and or what has given you support in your lives to get to where you are today, so that you can then in turn somehow live a more mindful day after this meditation. You won't be able to think of everything or everyone. Just step out of your own ways and see what arises in the mind when again you consider who or what has given you uplift to do the work that you're doing and be the person that you are now. This is not to be said out loud. Silently reflect upon this. We're just going to sit with this for a minute or two. If there's any sense of appreciation or gratitude, allow that to kind of percolate throughout the body as though it is oxygen that you breathe in, and it visits with every cell of your being. When we reflect upon gratitude, it removes some of the toxicity that might build up with emotions that are not helpful, not adaptive, and rather maladaptive. It's also been said that gratitude in many ways is the first step of being awakened, and being awake to our own stories and seeing how we are in fact interconnected with the lives and narratives of many others, especially when we consider who has given us support and maybe who we support after this meditation and beyond. I invite you to close this time, taking 3 closing breaths as naturally as you can. And with each exhale, just letting go of anything at all that you don't need. Tension, stress, even that which you can't articulate in word or thought. And once you've taken those 3 closing breaths, whether you're still in them now or you've already finished them, if you had your eyes gently closed, I invite you to reopen them, to get reacclimated to the lighting, with where you are, with what you're doing, being kind and compassionate to your bodies, circulating, stretching, shaking it out. And I want to end with a really profound gratitude to each and every one of you for co-creating this space and for being a part of this really special time, because it is hopeful and awe-inspiring to be here. And I just want to point out that you've been meditating for 30 minutes. That is a whole episode of The Simpsons with commercials. It is 3/4 of an episode of Law and Order minus the commercials. So this is a huge accomplishment. Even if the mind wandered, you got sleepy, drowsy, you drifted away. I think you've made the world a better place, truly, for taking this time and being who you will be after this meditation. And that is my cue to end right on time. It's 12:50, and so I hand it back to Dr. Camp. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Grainzvolt. That was amazing. So rather than attempt to follow that with words, I think we'll go right into our break. So I'm seeing 12:50. When we come back, it's going to be very interactive. And so we will have lots of conversation, lots of co-creation in our remaining workshops. So 12:50, we'll see you in 5 minutes. Move around, do what you got to do. Okay, so we're coming back from our break. And we will start getting ready for our next workshop. And okay, it is 12:55 according to my phone, and we will go into activism and wisdom traditions. Two amazing doctoral students at TC. We didn't plan it this, we didn't realize that stories would be so central to this. And Chris Torres is an amazing storyteller. I think of advocacy as the root of the word to vocate or to speak out. So storytelling is a really important part of advocacy, and I think that's something to keep in mind throughout the day here. Okay, so I'm going to try to spotlight our next facilitators. Okay, there we go. Amazing. And you should have screen sharing ability and breakout room ability, but just give me a heads up if you need anything.
Great.
So take it away, our amazing co-facilitators, Raaghav and Chris.
Thank you all so much for being here. I guess we should take a second to introduce ourselves and then we can jump in. Raaghav, do you
Sure.
want to take it away?
Sure. My name is Raaghav Pandya. I am a PhD student currently, almost done, and I study the intersections of Eastern wisdom traditions and contemplative philosophy and science education. So the basis of this talk and workshop really speak to me, and so I am grateful for Matt and Chris reaching out to lead this talk. Chris?
Yeah, I'm Christina or Chris. You could call me either or. I use she, her pronouns, and I am also a doc student in science ed with Raaghav. And so much of our work together in our classes made us realize that there's so many intersections between where he's coming from with his work in contemplative practices and where I'm coming from with my work in climate activism, and the intersections between those two things. As Matt already said, I do a lot of work in storytelling, and not just storytelling in the sciences, but also climate storytelling, and how we can use stories as a way to elevate voices that are normally not heard in the movement, but also use stories as a form of political action. Before we get started today, I'd like to do a bit of a land acknowledgement. I am currently in Washington Heights, which is a neighborhood in Manhattan. Manhattan is historically belonged to the Lenape people. And when the settlers came over and saw the Lenape people, we had an incredible amount of biodiversity here in New York City. And while we still have an incredible biodiversity here in New York City, a lot of that environmental, our natural history and cultural history has been lost. So as we acknowledge that history, I hope to not only reimagine our present, but also reimagine our future. Because while we do have a lot of amazing things in New York City, they are worth protecting. So I hope this is a restorative space that Raaghav and I both create today, where we can think of things like historicity, our current issues that we have here in New York City, and reimagine a more equitable future. With that, I'm going to hand the mic over to Raaghav and hopefully share my screen for our presentation today.
Thank you, Chris, for acknowledging the Indigenous land. I'm sure it's going to be hard to follow that guided practice we all just sat through, or Simpsons episode with the advertisement. And so if you could, oh, excellent, you're presenting your screen. So if you could go to the next slide.
Can you see the whole screen?
We see the whole screen. We don't actually see just a slideshow. So we see a, like how you would edit a PowerPoint. We see that page. We don't see a presentation.
Okay, let me just make sure that it's, hold on, give me 1 second, I'm sorry.
No, it's all good.
Sorry, it's like putting me into like a weird presentation mode. Hold on. Slideshow. I'd like to start from the beginning. Oh, okay. Let me share my screen. Okay.
Boom. Awesome. So we're going to talk today, obviously, a little bit about all of your backgrounds in, mindfulness, yoga, and wisdom traditions, but also how they connect to our activism work and the different interests that we've shared with the Padlet that Matt had given us access to. So the first thing I'd like to do, actually, if you go to the next slide, Chris, Dr. Yolanda Celia Rees here at TC always has an intention activity, where when we engage in a space like this with other people, whether it's a course, a workshop, a conference, we sit alone for a couple minutes, and we just did that through the guided meditation. But if we have a journal next to us, something to write with, or we could just think about it on our own, let's take a couple minutes to not only share what our experiences have been, if we have any, with something like Eastern spiritual practices or any wisdom traditions, but also what is our intention in doing this workshop? And then when we write that down, let's concentrate all of our thought into that intention. So when we go through this next hour, we are always, bringing it back to that bedrock. So let's take a couple minutes. If you need to turn your video off, feel free to do so. And when we come back, feel free to share. So Chris, I'll set a timer for about 1:05. Give everybody a couple minutes to concentrate on that.
Sounds great.
Just a reminder, we're taking this time to write down our intention for why we're here, what we want to get out of this workshop, what we want to learn from everybody else sharing this space. In a couple minutes, we will share this intention if we feel comfortable. Okay, hopefully that was a quick little, reminder of why we're here. If you feel comfortable, please do unmute yourself and share what you wrote down and give us some context.
Or drop it in the chat.
Or drop it in the chat. Matt, do you want to get us started at least?
I would love to, yeah. I wrote something about building power among community here, but also inspiring. And I thought about the word inspire has to do with breathing. It's just so crazy, right? Respiration, inspire. So something like that, I thought about Reverend Calvy's foundation discussion, or guided meditation about sitting, and so grateful for all the teachers and friends and family in my life who, enabled me to have a privileged position to host something like this and be in political conversations. And what I want to do is share that with other folks and saying, taking action is actually easier than it seems. We just have to do it. So on that, I'll hand it off to somebody who wants to sit in that front row of class and share their vulnerable moment as to why they're here.
I can say something. This is Virginia. Sorry, I've lost my ability to see where the chat function is, so I'm a little bit limited. I can only mute or unmute myself. I've studied Tibetan Buddhism for about 7 years, and I am very passionate about housing justice and real estate issues in New York City particularly, but all across the country really. And even though I've been studying Buddhism throughout my entire sort of entry into this space, I still haven't figured out how to use my studies and what I've learned about the body and the mind with regard to this particular issue. And I think part of it is that living, it's like, how you can have trauma and then there's repair after the trauma. People like me and those who I am fighting for are living within a traumatic experience with whether it's construction harassment or, a landlord situation. And so it's very hard to recover from trauma when you're living within it and you're also fighting, for housing justice, living within the experience. So it's sort of like you're still in it. And so it's I can't meditate my way out of the circumstances. So my goal is for today is really to try and figure out how I can actually use what I've learned in a way that actually serves the work, but also, helps me stay connected and use the energy of it for the work and for myself.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing, Virginia. There'll be plenty of opportunity to share later as well, Chris. So if we want to keep the ball moving, we could go on to the next slide. So just to build some context as to the conceptual framework of this workshop here, a lot of us sitting here might be familiar with the idea of wisdom traditions, whether they are of Native American, Indigenous, African, West African, Australian Aborigines. A lot of these communities, Indigenous communities, have wisdom traditions, but particularly we're going to be concentrated today on mindfulness, Buddhism, yoga. Generally speaking, South Asian, Indian wisdom traditions and their perspective on activism. As Matt had shared so beautifully his experience with yoga, and the mayor also shared his experience with mindfulness. We just wanted to discuss, Chris and I, some, I don't want to use the word theory, but perspective as to how these traditions see activism. And so whether it's a wisdom tradition from the West or the East, essentially their claim is the following: that an obsession of and a concentration of purely satisfaction and a feeding to materialism and the idea of consumption not only oppresses my self-worth, but the self-worth of others, whether it's an animal, somebody who doesn't look like me, somebody who's from another country, somebody who might live in less means. And so at the bedrock of all of these wisdom traditions is the idea of ahimsa, which literally translated means non-violence. You might have heard that from a Dr. King speech or a description of Gandhi, but various social activists have used this idea of ahimsa as the paradigm of their movement. And so this prayer that you see in italicized is a prayer shared by a lot of Eastern traditions that pray for the self-actualization of all sentient beings. And so when we do a practice in meditation or an empathy practice inspired by these philosophies, what they aim to achieve is the idea that when I slowly observe my mind and my body, I begin to realize that there's a unity of experience for peoples all over the world. And this experience is shared not only by the environment that you're currently in, but the environment across the globe, whether it be in nature, whether it be of an animal, whether it be of a person of another race. And so when I continuously try to obsess over my material well-being alone, I am oppressing others and oppressing my own worth. And with this basis, various social activists have attempted to make this the bedrock of any activism, whether it's climate activism and the Quechua people that Chris will talk about later, or racial equity, or even real estate equity. So as we go towards the breakout rooms and discussion, let's keep this in mind as the intention of any of these spiritual traditions. Chris, if you could go to the next slide, is not necessarily just the material and physical well-being of the planet, but a self-actualization, an inner to outer experience. We even discussed this in the guided meditation that we just talked about, how when I slowly begin to observe my own thoughts, my own emotions, I realize that we have a unity of experience, an experience shared by me, by Chris, by anybody in this talk who's sharing this space, or people of the past. And so there's three things that I wanted to highlight here of the wisdom traditions of the East. And the first is the definition of yoga. And in this definition of yoga, it is claiming that yoga is the stilling of the fluctuating states of the mind. Now, this sounds very, neuroscientific or psychoanalytical, but in its essence, what it's trying to say is that when we sit to meditate or ask ourselves why I have certain thoughts, what we learn is that behind the thoughts, I have an experience of being a subject in the world, somebody who's consciously experiencing the world. That is shared by everybody on earth. That is shared by every sentient being on earth. And that is the basis of all wisdom traditions and their perspective on activism. Particularly, even if you look at the idea of the interconnectedness of things in Buddhism, that I am because of something else. At the end of the guided meditation, we talked about how gratitude is the basis of wisdom. And he highlighted how when I think about how the people, my teachers, my family, the nature around me has made me who I am, this slowly makes me a person who's experiencing a unification with all of these people. When I learn to realize that I am because of the nature, I am because of my parents, I am because of my family, my friends, the people around me, the neighborhood, this idea that I am here to only satisfy myself slowly depletes. And so social activism is a byproduct of spiritual seeking. And Matt even discussed in the intro so beautifully about how efforts towards any advocacy work, whether it's policy or real estate or energy or education equity, working in action as thoughts in the Bhagavad Gita without an expectation of a fruit or a result. Now that seems so absurd. How can I possibly work for people's liberation, climate advocacy or racial equity without expecting any results, without expecting a policy shift, without expecting, funding? And the perspective that these wisdom traditions give is that when you work for these things, what you're really working for is the inner self-actualization, the inner well-being of those people. And so it's not dependent on only just a policy change or only just funding. And so these examples that I have here, whether it's Gandhi, the Dalai Lama, Pandurang Atavale, a 20th century social activist, and Reverend Kyoto Williams. She's one of the first Black ordained Buddhist monks. And they use these exact principles in their work for the liberation of people and the liberation of the planet. So if we had to unify the various wisdom traditions into a couple principles that really define how they perceive activism, it'd be the following. When I learn to observe my thoughts and emotions, we understand that there is a unity of experience as a subject in the world, as a sentient being in the world. And that experience is shared by all animals, all peoples across the earth. And secondly, social activism is a byproduct of spiritual seeking. When I seek to not only overcome my depleted self-worth, but the depleted self-worth of others, and work for the liberation of others or the planet, I am really detaching from this idea that consuming only for me will make me any happier. So this being the paradigm of the wisdom traditions, this being the bedrock of their perception of activism, we can think of some examples, such as the Quechua peoples, the indigenous people who have for centuries seen the climate and the environment as their family. Chris.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I would say, a beautiful thing about activism and action work that I feel everybody who is in this type of work arrives at these same conclusions, regardless if you have a name to put it on or not. It's the collectivist nature of our work and understanding the interconnectedness of not only the work that we do, but how our work connects to things so much bigger beyond ourselves. My story of how I arrived at these conclusions starts in a lab at the City College of New York, where I did my bachelor's and my master's degree in tropical ecology. And I had the amazing opportunity to go do work on the Galapagos Islands and in the Amazon rainforest and live a bit with a community of Quechua people. And my advisor, Dr. Amy Burkhoff, said, this experience of being in the field and working with people that not only live among this type of nature, but have generationally passed down knowledge about this nature, I am going to learn more in those couple of weeks than any type of graduate education that I can sit in. And I did. I didn't realize it at the time, but this moment was a complete turning point in not only my views as a scientist, but my own views as an eventual climate activist, which I wasn't at the time. Sitting amongst these people and talking to them not only about their generational knowledge, about how these species work together and how us with increasing scientific technology are only now catching up to the wisdom that these communities have already known for thousands and thousands of years of how nature already works, but they also see how it's changing. So after these experiences and lots of other science communication related activities, I started to pivot my own work of thinking about exactly what Raaghav just explained, more action-oriented science. How are we not only honoring these types of perspectives that should be more incorporated into the sciences, into the movement, and how are we using that not only for this type of self-actualization that Raaghav was talking about, but understanding the interconnectedness of social movements. So that's why we want to transition our talk today to how we can connect all of these types of traditions and our learnings to our own action work.
Before we do that, I just, when I think about how wisdom traditions are related to social reformation or activism, whether it's climate, racial, education equity, real estate equity, there's an incident that an indigenous person, somebody much wiser than me, once told me about climate and environmental advocacy. What she'd explained was, it is definitely noble for our generation and the younger generation to be so keen on protecting the environment, building more sustainable lives, more sustainable consumerism, and to leave a planet that is better for the next generation than it is for the previous one. But she said how we see the planet is not something to be saved. We see the planet as an equal. How it is violence to even break a tree for me, for various living things are sustaining their lives off that tree. So the perspective is different, where the work may be the same. So a climate activist who's a scientist who may not have the bedrock of wisdom traditions, and somebody who does have the bedrock of wisdom traditions, their climate activism may look the same, but the intention is slightly different in that way. That this entire planet is my family. And that graffiti piece actually you see on this slide is at TC in the basement near the cafeteria. And I was surprised to see it one day when I was going down to the printing office. It's actually Sanskrit. And the quote is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which means the entire earth is my planet. I mean, is my family. I'm sorry. The entire earth is my family. And with that attitude is how somebody influenced by the wisdom traditions promotes their advocacy. How can I possibly harm a tree? How can I possibly take not what is mine for my own pleasure, for my own benefit? So what's beautiful about what Chris said earlier is that, yes, there's a metaphysical interconnectedness that we understand through activities like meditation, that there's an interconnectedness of the nature, the people around me, my environment. But there's also a cross movement between advocacy movements, right? Like, how can I possibly work for the liberation of a group of people and not understand the liberation of another group of people or the sustenance of the planet? If they are all interconnected, the happiness of all are the same. So that is the attitude that somebody influenced by the philosophy of wisdom traditions perceives reformation and advocacy. Chris, you wanted to interrupt me?
And I think, people ask me all the time through my work, what does the future of this work look like? And I think a lot of people who do this type of work are constantly asked these questions. What is the next iteration, the next step? What do you imagine climate activism looking like 10 years from now? And I think we are at the cusp of this right now. And I think we're going to see this play out on a much larger stage over the next decade. And it's this same route. We, in the climate activism work that I do, we take a very broad definition to the term sustainability. Any group, any system that is unfair to certain groups is by definition unsustainable. So through my climate action work, we haven't only looked at things like divestment from fossil fuels, we also look at divestment from private prisons. And a lot of times when we talk about these things to different audiences, the big question comes up, well, how does divesting from private prisons have anything to do with climate change? And I think it's because this interconnectedness, while obvious to many of us that do this type of work, isn't necessarily in the popular consciousness yet. So I would love over the next decade, as like a huge goal of my own, not only to push, climate justice forward, but also work towards the ways in our lives with our sphere of influences that we all have in our communities. Think about ways that we can build these connections and build these inroads between how we can connect different aspects of the movement together. A lot of this inspiration comes from Simard's work, Finding the Mother Tree. I got my copy out of my bookcase for the presentation. A wonderful, wonderful book if you have not read it, Finding the Mother Tree, Suzanne Simard. And all of her work, she's a forest ecologist, has to do with forest interdependence and this beautiful mycorrhizal network that exists underneath the forest. And older trees have more of these fungi, more of these mycorrhizal networks. And through these networks, trees not only talk to each other to warn of different infestations or drought events, but they also share resources. It's the forest in of itself is a collectivist nature, which we're only really learning about. We're just scratching the surface of it scientifically. But in wisdom traditions and indigenous practices, they've been talking about this for thousands of years. So I hope we take inspiration from the forest. We take inspiration of all of these values as we move forward through our work. With that, Raaghav and I have been talking for a long time. We want to give you all a chance to take what we've talked about, plus everything you all already know from your own work, to think about approaches. So we want to share, we're going to go into breakout rooms. We're going to
Chris, just one thing
Yes,
before
go
we
ahead.
move on. I wanted to open the floor if anybody had a question or comment before because we talked a lot about Eastern wisdom traditions and their philosophical framework and how they see activism. If there's any questions, concerns, or experiences that somebody has with them, feel free to share here before we move on to the breakout rooms, because then we'll be in smaller groups talking specifically about our activism and academic interests related to what we just discussed. I didn't mean to cut you off, Chris.
No, that is totally fair. I go, it's good to stop for questions.
Okay, great. I hope it wasn't an information overload. We'd spoken to Matt about it earlier, but I'm so glad he brought up the Bhagavad Gita and the idea of ahimsa and working without fruit attachment in the beginning. So it was a perfect segue into our breakout rooms. Matt, were you about to say something?
Just wondering, yeah, thank you. I wonder how many breakout rooms you'd like. I'm about to create them.
So how many? We have currently 20-ish people. So maybe 7 if we could do 3 per. Chris, how's that sound?
Yeah, that sounds great.
The only thing is,
if you can leave me and Raaghav out of the breakout room so we can float between the rooms,
Okay.
that's great.
Okay, got it.
So just to recap, we're gonna drop this information in the chat so you all have it in breakout rooms. But a few things we want you all to cover. I think we have like 15 to 20 minutes in these rooms, so you can spend some silent time reflecting on what you all just learned about, or just, expanding upon what you already learned about. And then sharing with the people in your group about how does this paradigm play into your work? What does spreading awareness really mean? And this looks very different in different social movements. So what does spreading awareness look like for you in the movements that you care about? What are some examples of how we can implement wisdom traditions into our work? And how does it build community in our teams? So a couple of things to unpack. We'd love for you to do this in groups, introduce yourselves to each other, have the discussion. We're going to then come back after 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll allow time for groups to share out. So I'm going
just a couple of things, Chris, before we do that. We wanted the 2 discussion sections to be one a little bit more general. So how do we see wisdom traditions and Eastern frameworks from mindfulness, Buddhism, or yoga applied to activism in general? And then the second half, discuss a little bit more specifics about your academic or activism interests, your team that you work with, and how it could be applied there. And the yellow is highlighted, the awareness part, because you could also take awareness to be the more metaphysical awareness that we just discussed and highlighted through the guided practices. So keep that in mind when we go into our breakout rooms. And I think that it would be a better idea to do fewer breakout rooms, because I'm not sure everyone might have the capability wherever they are right now to participate. So if we have like maybe 5 rooms, how's that sound, Matt? It might be easier for people to participate.
Yeah, let's do 5, and then we could just jump in and out, and Joey and I could also jump in and out. So
sounds good.
To create them right now.
We will be back at 1:45, Chris.
Okay. Great. It should be open. Yep. Okay, yeah, it looks like they're working. Mhm. Do you guys have the controls for the breakouts? Do you see that yet?
Yeah, I'm just trying to move people right now.
Yeah,
so
yeah, yeah.
who's in a
Okay.
room by themselves.
Right, right, right.
Two.
Okay, great.
Oh, I just discovered where I have that.
Yes.
By the way, Matt, thank you for mentioning that in the beginning. I didn't think you were going to go there, but it was a perfect
It's still something I
alley oop.
grapple with. Yeah, alley oop, and just like the most profound thing, like that all is action, and that you're not entitled to the results. Like, I'm so glad you mentioned, the funding piece, and because a lot of times we are so driven by that kind of attainment and grasping of a we want this to turn into a bill or funding. But yeah, so great synergy there.
I hope it made sense. I tried to make it succinct, but
Yeah. So should we join on our own, like just
Yeah, I'm gonna
Yeah.
jump in the rooms.
Okay, great.
I'm gonna go to room 3.
Okay, I'll go to
I'm
2.
gonna run to the bathroom real quick and be right back.
Okay, I'll go to 2. Maybe Joe, you want to go to 1?
Yes, sounds
Okay.
good.
Decent.
Matthew,
Where you going,
can you
Chris?
hear me? Yeah. Matt, can you hear me?
Oh, I think he went to room 2.
Who is just asking for Matt? We can.
Oh, his
There.
mom. I'm his mom. And
Oh, hello.
hello. I didn't want to go to a breakout room, but I was
Okay.
wondering if I could pop in and out just to observe. Is that possible? If not, I'll wait. It's not a big thing.
Observe the general talk or the specific breakout room?
The breakout rooms without participating.
Yeah, that's fine. You could keep your video mute and mic off if you'd just like to observe, and then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
Yeah, that's
I
fine.
will do that. Thank you.
Mhm.
Welcome back, everyone. We'll give everybody a second to come back into the main room.
When people are late coming back into the main room, it's always a good sign.
Yeah, that means really productive conversation was going on.
Yeah.
Great. How were your discussions? You can use your emoji reactions. Was it a thumbs up? Was it, I don't know, you have so many options. You have all the emojis if you have the Zoom update.
I think you have the mind blown option too.
Word. I think the emoji I'm going to choose, I think I'm just going with the plain heart. It's just like so amazing to see everybody here today. Yeah, Alfred understood the assignment with the heart. It's just so amazing to see everybody here today on a Sunday, all working towards really beautiful things. So I want to thank you all again for being here. We want to create space for you all to share the discussions that you all were having in your rooms, because while like Raaghav and Matt and Joey and I were all bouncing between the rooms and got to hear all of these amazing discussions, not everybody had that luxury. So I took a picture of the rooms that we were in. The James, Louise, Thomas, and Virginia room. I would love for whoever was in that room to unmute and talk about the types of conversations that you were having in your room.
Yeah, that one was dropping some gems.
That was the room 2. But I don't know who wants to start from room 2.
All right, well, I guess I'll speak, but we talked a lot about housing. Sorry, that's one of my issues. It's not real estate justice, by the way. It's housing. It's housing justice. Real estate has their own justice. It's called money. I was just, I just was talking about, one of the things I learned in studying Buddhism was about that the concept of all beings being our mothers, and that we aren't necessarily related. Whether we had good mothers or good fathers or not, that we have the capacity to mother each other, and probably are mothering someone right now through our work, for people who may not be aware that we are mothering them, and that there's also people that are mothering us, people who, like for me, I'm not fighting for climate justice, I'm fighting for housing justice, but there are people out there who are fighting for all of us for climate justice. So that was my sort of connection with, the spiritual aspect of this work. I mean, that's where I was coming from. Louise was talking about her situation with housing, and even just like talking, like we were learning from each other, and that's also mothering. We don't, we come together, we hear things on the news, we chat in a chat room, and we are learning and growing together. And that's a spiritual connection. It's not always just knowledge or education that we share. Sometimes it's just awareness and bringing a good intention to the people we listen to and talk to.
I love that we're, through these types of experiences, we're growing together. I think that, at least like if I can like talk about a main goal of, I don't know, I think this entire workshop that we're doing, the entirety of the TC Advocacy Academy that Matt runs, I feel like a huge goal of that is growth and how we can grow together as a community. So I love that that's an experience that you all got in your breakout room. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Louise.
Hi, this is Louise. Hello.
Yep, we can hear you.
We can hear you, Louise.
I was in the room with Virginia, and like she said, it was really awesome. And I had to tell her I learned something that I didn't know. And within our group, we also talked about the earth and how the feedback we get when we do discuss on saving the earth or whatever. So it was really awesome, and I really learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. Virginia, your reflection made me think about how in wisdom traditions and just, spiritual philosophies, whether it's Buddhism or any indigenous thought, they often refer to things like rivers or the sun or trees as family members. Like they'll refer to with a river as like a mother, or a tree as a brother, or the planets as uncles. And it really, when you're younger, it kind of feels like it's a cute way to remember everything. But as you grow older and you think about why that is the paradigm through which people of wisdom traditions are taught, it's like, at one point you experience an interconnectedness, a family feeling with, as you were saying, everybody or everything around you.
I was just, on that note, if I could find it, I could paste the link, but I guess a couple of people were arrested because there's a park along the FDR Drive. I forget the name of it, but the city's trying to raise it because there's a lot of flooding that happens there. And a couple of activists got arrested because they were cutting down cherry trees. Did anybody else hear about that?
I know the activists who were arrested. Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay. So you know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I could give a whole nother 1 hour talk on the East River Park. If anybody is interested to learn more about what's happening at the East River Park, Raaghav and I are going to share our contact information at the end. I would be more than happy to talk to you offline. Yes. With that, I also want to create space for the amazing conversations that were being held in breakout room 3. So that's Alfred, that's Janelle, that's Omar. Would anybody like to unmute from breakout room 3 and talk about the types of things that were being said?
Yes, hello, everybody. Yeah, one of the things that I think permeated the discussion is the importance of the tranquility and calmness in the environment. And I know one of the things that Jeanette pointed out is, her difference of experiences when she was in New York City, where everything is tight and close together, and it's kind of difficult in creating your own safe space, let alone welcoming the safety of the space of others, and how the environment in her rural upbringing in West Texas was important in having tranquility and expansiveness that's a welcoming space for people to join. So I'm going to stop it there because I think Jeanette and Omar may want to speak.
Hello, it's Janelle, and thank you for picking up on that and continuing the discussion to the larger platform. I also learned a lot from you in that your interaction engagement with space and the variety of diversity of people that you lived with in Washington Heights. I also learned that Omar, who joined our discussion, was engaging in that he said up front, I am Jamaican, but I'm still of African experience. And he continued his discussion. One of the things that was so inspiring to me that we had this time to come together as a small group and then go into the big group. Because with the small group, I was able to express my appreciation and gratitude for this day and the way it was laid out. Matt did a wonderful introduction with allowing us to breathe and to meditate. And I love that we started with quiet meditation, and then he brought in the mayor, who has all kinds of, tucks and pulls at his responsibility in that urban jungle. And yet he told us that being emotional intelligence and being able to meditate was a part of the sustainability that he had in his career. So it's, you know, I am just appreciative that we have this experience on a Sunday. And it was a very competitive toss-up. Was I going to go to church today? Or was I going to be a part of this discussion? And of course, mindfulness won out. So just all encompassing what Christy had to say with nature and trees talking to each other, and the breathing and the calm and the peace and the tranquility that emerged with the group, the small group that I was in. It was so welcoming. And this is just a great experience to be a part of.
Thank you, Janelle, so much for sharing that experience. Just want to do a quick little wrap up before we move on. Thank you all again for joining us in this space and helping us create it. I hope we got one step closer to realizing how our inner lives and the wisdom provided to us by traditions like yoga and mindfulness Buddhism really empower our activism. With that said, here are some contact links, my LinkedIn profile, Christina's LinkedIn profile, and our email addresses as well. We're very easy to reach. If you want to further this conversation, learn more about it, even do some more workshops with whatever teams you're working with, please do reach out to us. Thank you again to all of you. And we would like to thank the space, as Christina had shouted out in the beginning, and hope we're continuing the work of the ancestors.
Thank you.
Thank you, Raaghav, Christina, everybody part of this last session. Amazing work. So great to hear how people are connecting, uplifting. We're now joined by Mr. Robert Taylor Jr. Robert, welcome, welcome. So good to see you. Robert is program administrator for Mindful NYU and Global Spiritual Life at New York University, and will kick us off on cultivating beloved community. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Matthew. Welcome, everyone. I'm Robert, pronouns in East, he, him, and himself, and I'm really grateful to be sharing space with you all today. It seems like we've been doing a lot, and so I just want to offer us a moment to shift from where we were to where we are going to be. And so whatever that looks like for you, please feel free to do so. If that is permission to get up and move, if that is refilling the coffee, because I can't stomach lukewarm coffee. And so if you need to zap it just for a minute, go ahead and do that. If we're in our homes and have access to fuzzy socks, or maybe just want to, shake up a little bit, I invite you to do so. If you're feeling like you could use just a little bit more grounding, much like a lot of the meditations that have been happening throughout the space, we'll have some room for that as well. But just a deep cleansing breath in through the nose, allowing to hold it at the top and releasing it out through the mouth with some audible sound. Ending that cycle with 2 more deep breaths in through the nose and released out through the mouth. Awesome. And if you are still able to hear the sound of my voice, don't feel the rush to come back to the screen just as yet. Stealing just that extra moment for yourself before we move on, or we start with this Cultivating Beloved Community session. At the Center for Global Spiritual Life, we draw a lot of inspiration from the life and teaching of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And so his principles on nonviolence influence a lot of what you're going to be seeing in today's presentation, deeply influenced by Eastern traditions of mindfulness, combined with some of the Western science-based aspects of mindfulness. We end with a set of questions that we want to ask ourselves about what it looks like to truly be in community with one another. And in service of doing so, what happens when things go awry? How do we pull on some of those teachings of mindfulness to allow us to have grounded, embodied responses as opposed to be constantly reacting? I can certainly appreciate that there might be urgency that we feel in a lot of our movement spaces, but how can we also invite for a pause and for rest in the midst of that urgency? And so as we continue in our session today, I'm going to set another container for us within our conversation to look at some of our care agreements, those being curiosity, candor, confidentiality, care, calling in, co-authoring, and come as you are. I'm seeing that there is. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Thank you for sharing that, Virginia. And so as you take a moment to look at the care agreements, are there any additions to this that we would like to insert before moving forward? I can't see you all, so if you would like to share either in the chat or by unmuting, please feel free to do so. And if not, can I get a either virtual emoji thumbs up or a physical one from your respective places? Wonderful, we will move forward. What are our goals today? We're here to learn, possibly, some new tools for trust building within our community through radical care and connection. We're going to build an appreciation for and comfortability with deep complexity. And ultimately, we're here to learn and practice collaborative tools for strong cross-communal engagement, steeped in curiosity, understanding, and compassionate connection. And so it's important for us to ground. I'm familiar with one of the versions of meditation that you all engaged with this morning, but is there a meditation that you haven't done that you might like to try? Were we just following the breath? Did a body scan happen? I don't believe that there are specific activist-oriented meditations, but I believe generally all meditations are purposeful, depending on what we're doing. And so I'll start with one and then we'll flow into another and we'll close out our grounding. And so there's no need to enter any sort of formal posture of meditation, but I'm just going to ask you to begin by taking a deep breath in through the nose for a count of 4 and releasing it out through the nose for a count of 4. And just for a moment, we're going to keep this breath count in for 4 and out for 4, just for a moment. If it feels good and purposeful for you to have your eyes closed, feel free to do so. But there's no need. And as you continue to take those deep breaths in, invite yourself to deepen the count. To allow the breath to dance in the body along the count of 4. And for it to be released for a count of 4. As the count softens and deepens, inviting the breath to move past the chest into the belly. Beginning to pay such close, deep attention that you notice the sensation of cloth against the skin. You can witness the expansion and contraction of the lungs. And this time we'll shift to continue to breathe in through the nose for a count of 4, but this time releasing for a count of 6. In through the nose. Count of 4, out through the nose for a count of 6. And we'll hold this breathing ratio for another minute. As we're breathing, noticing if there's any tension in the body, allowing the shoulders to drop away from the ears. Maybe inviting our jaw to unclench, for the tongue to fall away from the roof of the mouth and to rest lovingly in its natural home. Possibly we're holding tension in our thighs or in our calves. And as we focus on those last 6 counts out, that we release any tension being held in the body. And as it feels good for you, coming back to screen. Okay, either by unmuting or in the chat, which breath count felt like it served the most? In for 4 and out for 4, or in for 4 and out for 6? Which breath count served you the most? In for 4, out for 6. 4 and 6. 4 and 6. And so these two, as these continue to come in, these two breathing ratios, 4 for 4 and 4 for 6, are scientifically proven to regulate the nervous system. And so some might look at it as a meditation in and of itself. Others might see it as a tool for self-regulation. I like to couch them in the language of tools for self-regulation. Why? Because you don't have to enter that formal seated posture. We're not paying attention to the alignment in our spine or to too much that's going on around us, but we're able to use it. And it does stimulate the vagus nerve. We're allowed to use this, these 2 breathing ratios to get our system in alignment at any time. And so really great for you to be using at any moment where you might not be able to pop off for a body scan before entering a conversation. Or maybe you're on the train and you're finding that you're needing some additional grounding before getting ready to enter a difficult conversation. You can use this tool for self-regulation to support you in not reacting, but responding. And I'm going to come back to this piece about offering an embodied response throughout our conversation today, because we find it purposeful for the conversation on cultivating this beloved community. And so as I've continued to share a slide today, I like to begin by just naming that self-awareness is the compass, right? That if we were to assign a superpower, although I might prefer teleportation, attention is a superpower that we all have capacity to hold on to. And when we really think about it, it's not something that can be taken away from you unless you're giving it away. And so if we examine the actions of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., what might we think the benefits were from how he trained his attention throughout his life? When it comes to activism and advocacy surrounding civil rights in his time, what was the purpose or what was the benefit of having additional attention trained on the single goal of increased presence and embodied awareness? And the same would go for Nelson Mandela. And so if we can hold on in our mind's eye just for a moment, when you think about your personal experience, is there a moment in your life, a time where you noticed that your attention was deeply engaged in something? What was the result? How did it feel? And then let's bring in another scenario where we had our attention trained and then it was taken by something being derailed momentarily that ended up consuming the final product. Or maybe we started and then allowed ourselves to be more concerned about something that was going to be happening just at the end of this meeting and maybe not what's happening in the present moment. And it sounds like we've been continuing to have some conversations on the benefits of mindfulness, but within the context of this conversation, what are some ways for us to define this thing that is mindfulness? And so if I started at the bottom with John Kabat-Zinn, he would say that mindfulness is paying attention on purpose in a particular way without judgment. And then from there, Dan Harris would state that mindfulness is the ability to know what's happening in your mind at any given moment without getting carried away by it. And Melissa Carter, the director of our center here at Mindful NYU, says that mindfulness is a state of present moment awareness. And so with the varying definitions all sort of connected through this common theme, are there any parts of definitions of mindfulness that are resonating or calling out to folks in particular at this moment? In our next, I'm seeing a chat here. No judgment and no reactivity are key. Recognizing a story, but not getting carried away by it. Totally. The without judgment piece ends up being the hardest part of the mindful practice for me, because the brain does some funny things, of which we will get into momentarily. Because there has to be some understanding or some context for what is going on in the body and in the brain that I believe supports distilling some of the practices of mindfulness into some action. And so today, I'm going to be focusing on 3 sections of the brain. The first being the reptilian brain, the primal stem, somewhere located right here at the base of the neck where it meets the brain or the head. The limbic brain, our friend, sort of like curved just so slightly in past the reptilian brain, and the frontal neocortex hanging out right here in the front of our minds. And so this reptilian brain that we have is responsible for a few things, often known for being responsible for flight, fright, freeze. In the mindfulness world, we also like to say that it's responsible for restore, but we have to do some things to be able to get to that place of restoration. The reptilian brain might seem to be responsible for our knee-jerk reactions. The limbic brain, that emotional or feeling brain, is where our stories live. And then we have the frontal neocortex, that rational or thinking brain. This is the place that mindfulness settles in, I like to say. That mindful practices move us from the reptilian and limbic brain into the frontal neocortex. This is that place where we notice that present moment awareness. And so if I were to use the example of how I got this little scar here on my hand, it would be the story of the first time that I discovered an iron, and it was very hot. And so I burned myself. I responded. I'm pretty sure there were a lot of tears and needs for comfort. And that was my reptilian brain sort of like getting into action to go, "Ooh, girl, that's hot, don't touch it anymore." And then the limbic brain, the part that feels and holds on to the emotion, remembers that that iron is hot. But what happens if I continue to stick in the loop between reptilian and limbic brain, spinning this narrative of the iron is hot, don't go near it? I might have crushed clothes for the rest of my life. And so what mindfulness does in this scenario is asks the body to cool down, to get into a state of regulation, moves us out of the reptilian brain, out of the limbic brain and into the frontal neocortex. And so when we look at just in terms of proximity, what is going on in the brain, there are a few things. The reptilian brain is located next to the limbic brain. And so it's going to turn on first. If we imagine the brain as a set of circuits, the limbic brain is going to turn on first. And because the frontal neocortex has so much more neural circuitry, so much more pathways, it takes a little bit more time for that to turn on. The last piece that I'd like to name before moving on here is that we have a study that's coming out of UCLA, produced in 2008. The title of that study is The Pains and Pleasures of Social Life. And I bring it up because when we think about the purpose of this session, right, to cultivate this beloved community, to be in community with one another, to think about senses of belonging, the brain registers a lack of belonging as physical pain. And so what does that say of group spaces where someone doesn't feel like they belong and pain is being registered in the body? Might it also be similar to how I got this burn from that iron, that you get stuck from this lack of belonging in a loop between the reptilian brain and the limbic brain? And so now understanding some of the tools for self-regulation supports us in allowing ourselves to be a little bit more present, and then also gives an understanding of what might be going on for other folks who we find ourselves in community with, and what we might want to be mindful of as we do this work of cultivating this community. I'll pause just for a moment at the end of this section on the brain and science to pause for any questions. But before I do, I'd like to bring in the work of Dr. Sarah King. She says that social justice and well-being are one and the same thing. And why might that be? In the work that Dr. Sarah King does with Mind Heart Consulting, she says that all of our human interactions are bio-psycho-social. That there is a biological component, psychological component, and social component to all of our interactions. And so we take her thinking from her consulting agency. We combine it with our conversation on the brain to then go a little bit deeper into the body to see what's going on and bring this all home. And so in front of you, I have pictured the autonomic nervous system. And although I am a born and bred New Yorker, which means that I don't have a driver's license, I'm going to use the example of driving a car. Your autonomic nervous system, comprising of a few of our friends depicted here, parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems, are the gas and the brake pedal of the body. When we are in fight or flight, right here on the sympathetic nervous system side, we're engaging that nervous system, which is essentially our gas pedal. This allows us to switch, to move, to pivot, to change. It means that it's helpful for us to leave spaces that are painful, spaces that are not inclusive. This is your body coming into action. And so as we continue here, when the body encounters stress, it's then going to press on the brake. It's going to press on the parasympathetic nervous system. When we encounter people who we've been socialized to see as other, the sympathetic nervous system, the gas pedal, switches on. And so this can look like a certain sense of violence that shows up in our interactions. And so when the sympathetic nervous system gets us to a place where the sympathetic nervous system can essentially hijack the body. It can say, I'm taking control, which means that your frontal neocortex is not going to turn on and we're just existing in that loop. And so this is where we might begin in our social interactions to begin feeling some senses of shame or of guilt. And I want to name for us that that quite literally is a trauma response, that the trauma, we must remind ourselves, is held in the body. And so as we're doing this thing of mindfulness, something so oftentimes seen as open and relaxing as a body scan might actually begin to encounter some senses of trauma within the body that need to be addressed, that helps us be just a little bit more present. And so in moments of deep complexity and tension, the body, quite simply because it is wired to protect ourselves, might shut down. And that's why we return to tools for self-regulation, like we started our conversation with in for 4, out for 4, or in for 4, out for 6, to begin regulating the nervous system, which allows us to tap into that space of radical care and compassion, because what? We kind of need it. The invitation here is to extend some additional grace, understanding that the body might be responding from a place of safety and concern. And then 2, to continue to think about how you've set the container for folks to be able to do that act of self-regulating so that you can have a co-regulated community. And so I'm seeing some chats in the comments. I'm going to pause just for a moment here to read them and to allow any questions to surface as well. Virginia is saying that Dan Siegel's work in interpersonal biology is helpful in understanding this too. Interpersonal neurobiology, thank you for that. Are there any questions about what might be happening from the brain into the autonomic nervous system and relating that back to mindfulness before I move us into another section of our presentation? You know, I'm not able to answer that question, Alfred, because I'm a historian. So I haven't spent much time thinking about the gallbladder, but if there's anyone who's able to maybe offer some thoughts on what might be going on there in the gallbladder, I'm not too sure. Any other questions? I'm seeing here from Google that the gallbladder stores bile produced by the liver.
A great question. I think that there's so much more to know, you know, being gallbladder connected to the other parts of the digestive system, which are, you know, we're just discovering new neurons. So who knows?
Mm-hmm. Certainly, Paulette, I'm seeing your question about talking about how the lack of belonging is experienced as pain. And so from my understanding of that survey that was done in 2008, The Pains and Pleasures of Social Life, you'll be able to find that in the Neuroleadership Journal. Folks who were engaged in the 8-week course on mindful practice did a series of MRI scans over that 8-week period of time that was looking particularly at the brain's flight and flight center, and also the amygdala, as well as the sort of like primal regions of the brain that are particularly associated with fear and emotion. And so they noticed over that 8-week period of time that the amygdala, and I'll go back to the amygdala, our little green friend hanging out here on this diagram, began to shrink. And so if self-regulation allows the frontal neocortex to turn on, and the mindful practice allows for this area to shrink in general, it means that when something is happening, thank you, Matthew, when something is happening in the body, the time that it takes to turn on from reptilian to frontal neocortex shortens. And so if you imagine this large warehouse and you're turning the light on at the front, the first few lights will flicker on first before the last lights flicker on. And so what this does is shorten the amount of time that it will take for the circuit to turn on the entirety of the system. It gets you a little bit sort of like quicker into that embodied state of being. And so in particular, what you'll see in the Pain and Pleasures study is that the brain quite simply just registers that lack of belonging as the same degree as like physical pain. There's no distinguish between what might be the not so serious piece versus the I'm experiencing bodily harm. Right. If you think about also just like a snapshot of how this might function, if you are sensitive because of a set of circumstances that have happened in your life to loud sound, if something falls on the floor, the reptilian brain is not going to distinguish between needing to run away for safety or being able to name that you dropped your hydro flask on the floor and that was the sort of like ruckus that was made. And so these questions are good to keep coming in for additional points of clarification. But now I want to talk about what happens when we find ourselves in difficult conversations. how do we notice that the body responds? If you find yourself entering a conversation that's going to be particularly tense, what do you notice? Are there any sensations that arise in the body in a particular place? If you even want to think back to the autonomic nervous system in its entirety, do you notice that maybe you're tensing up a little bit more? Has your breath quickened? Is there anyone who's able to sort of like either unmute or in the chat, just name for the group what happens to you? I know for myself that I feel some tension in my chest. It's like, oh, I don't want to do this. I'm seeing panic, feeling heat. I particularly feel heat around my ears. Wild. Not sure why. Anyone else noticing sensation as it arises in the body? Tensing up. And then as you're getting ready to enter that tense conversation or a conversation that you assume is going to be intense, you carry that energy with you into that space. And so what happens if there is someone in your community who is naming a need because they are hurt, and you're steeling yourself up to prevent from receiving that hurt, right? And so as I named that, when our autonomic nervous system is, sort of like engaged, it might show up as a certain level of violence in communities and in conversations. Why? Because your body is preparing itself for something and someone else's body is preparing it for something. And so might that insert of a pause be purposeful, even if just for a moment, so that everyone is able to begin naming their need and offering some sort of embodied response. I often find that we're almost ready to just like instantly engage in difficult conversation, or it's like, oh, okay, well, I just need to get it over with. Like, say what you have to say and go. What might it look like to go, I'm noticing some sensation in my body that I just need to check in with a little bit, right? And before I engage in this conversation, can I just have one moment? And then maybe that's where you begin using that breathing ratio, right? Again, the thing of not mindfulness on the formal meditation cushion, but mindfulness in action to support you in getting to a space of regulation for what could potentially be a difficult conversation. At the Center for Global Spiritual Life, we've developed this framework in Stoplight of Emotions. We find that in the two categories at the top, both in discomfort and in resistance, that growth is possible. In that space of harm trigger, we notice that there is a moment of dissociation and hypervigilance, and that the categories of the first three boxes, discomfort, resistance, and harm trigger, oftentimes get muddied. And so I've heard a lot that folks will name that they are uncomfortable. And I'm like, okay, good. And so when people say like, I'm not comfortable with it, I'm like, okay, great. What are we going to do with that now? I don't believe colloquially that discomfort or being uncomfortable is used in the way that it's framed in the stoplight of emotions. Have we ever been in conversations where someone's like, I feel uncomfortable, and that socially is supposed to mean that we should stop having the conversation? Right? And so my analogy, which I've heard many people use time and time again, and just like, why? I like to talk about the lobster. The lobster hangs at the bottom of the sea. This might not be accurate for my marine biologist, but you'll let me know. Hangs out at the bottom of the sea, and because it feels internal pressure to grow and is experiencing external pressure from the sea, it eventually is going to molt its skin to allow for that new growth. And so I say that you can grow in discomfort because you need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. If the lobster doesn't feel the internal pressure to grow and to change and to develop, it won't molt its shell. It won't get into that space of vulnerability. I saw someone mention Brene Brown in the chat earlier, which is all about shame, all about vulnerability and empathy, right? And so we have these sort of examples that are out there in sort of like short clips that so that there's something about discomfort that is purposeful for this thing of being in relationship, not just with ourselves, but with others. And so now moving from discomfort into the space of resistance, I believe what some folks stop at saying, I'm uncomfortable with this, is maybe needing to be shifted to that space of resistance. It is perfectly fine, okay, and necessary for you to actually go, I'm noticing that I'm in resistance to a thing that you mentioned earlier, or I'm not really into the whole science of the brain thing. And so I'm like stuck on that one part about like, why is the amygdala green? And so as the facilitator, I've moved on and I'm now sort of like 3 slides into the presentation. And because you haven't named that resistance, we're not together. And then so if I continue on in conversation and I continue to drop some hot takes about purple amygdalas, you're like, whoa, wait a minute. I'm still over here trying to process this piece. And so if we zoom out from the purpose of, from the context of green amygdalas and this conversation and pull it into our daily lives, the work that we do, the communities that we engage in, are there also moments where you personally haven't named resistance and it didn't serve you or the group that you're organizing with later? And so all of a sudden we have this moment where progress feels like it's being derailed because you're still struggling with something. And this is not to say that we don't hold our community with love and care as they struggle with something, but it means that there's an invitation to name that resistance so that we can do something with it. Lastly, I want to look at this category of harm and trigger. I work on a college campus. And so oftentimes we find that the term trigger is used quite often. And so the way that we respond to harm and trigger must look different. Then oftentimes it is implemented. Harm trigger does not mean that the conversation is shut down and it's over. It means that we actually need to get into community care. It means that we need to return to those guidelines that we set at the onset of a conversation, that place where we set the container for meaningful and purposeful engagement, and to begin calling on the people who are responsible for holding the space together, to begin caring for the people in the group. And so we'll say in that space of harm trigger, you can't continue having that difficult dialogue because the body is not prepared to move from that space of tenseness, of being shut down, right? If we go back to that slide again on the autonomic nervous system, the frontal neocortex is hijacked. And so you might want to be responding from a place like, that's not what I intended. Who cares? I quite literally cannot receive it because the frontal neocortex is offline. And this is why I think it's purposeful for us to connect that science-based element of mindfulness to an understanding of the brain and what's going on in the body, so that when we get to the space of how do we actually put this into action, we don't allow our reactionary selves to be guiding the conversation to go, oh no, I've hurt somebody. And to move more so into that space of, okay, let me pause here for a moment, see what's going on, and begin responding to what the need is. It's how we most need connection, or when we are least often wanting to reach out from shame or fear. Exactly. And so what does it look like? Again, coming back to having your attention trained that supports you in engaging in conversations that are difficult yet necessary. I've taken a good portion of time explaining this, so I'm going to briefly run through a few slides to get us into a conversation on what some of the barriers to belonging are. Again, as I mentioned, we pull from Dr. King's teachings on beloved community. And so he says that it is a global vision in which all people can share in the wealth of the earth. Racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice will be replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of interconnection, love, trust, and peace. And you can find a portion of this on the King Center's website. And so we have this Dr. King-inspired thinking on beloved community and belongingness. And then we turn to this science-based definition on belonging, of which I say heavily science-based and not translated so much, because I think what Brene Brown does so well is that she takes the science part of it and turns it into a way that is digestible for folks who don't want to talk about what is maybe sort of like going on in the brain and want to be able to connect to it from an everyday experience. But here we have belongingness is a psychological term that refers to a person's perception of the amount of social support and acceptance they receive. Researchers have determined that belongingness is an evolutionary need for safety, support, and connection. A high sense of belongingness and social support is positively correlated with mental health, quality of life, and improved physical health and a sense of well-being. And so Dr. King has us thinking about the values that we need present in a world where we feel like we truly belong. And so can we just take a moment in the chat to put some of those values that we think are necessary to craft that world where we belong? I imagine that these are some of the values that will also overlap with the advocacy work that you do in your respective places. And so I'm seeing them come in from Virginia: fairness, equity, what other values need to be present? Access to justice, open communication, openness, justice and equity and trust, respect, trust with the other, dignity. And so as we continue to think about the values that need to be present to create this sense of belongingness more broadly, let's also think about some of those barriers that we encounter. And this can be on a few levels, right? Because barriers don't just operate in a way where you can simply sidestep them and then you've made it, right? They operate on personal, interpersonal, structural, societal, and institutional levels. And so when you think about some of the barriers to belongingness, some of the barriers that these values are supposed to be addressing, what are they? What are they? Personal biases, institutions with that encourage resentment, greed. I'm seeing two spaces: church and intellectual environments where I belong, but mainly home is the greatest investment in self. Seeing access. And so now I'm going to do a little bit of that, work some Zoom magic, and I'm going to put us into breakout rooms, because now I'd actually like for us to begin practicing another tool that helps us address that thing that comes up in moments of deep complexity. And so, give me one moment. Would someone mind unmuting and reading the prompt? Matthew, you're muted.
That's so funny. Sorry about that. The practice tools for mindful listening. So the speaker will share a challenge with belonging that you are experiencing right now or have in the past, and how you felt and what you needed. So again, a challenge with belonging, and then the listener will mindfully breathe, stay with any discomfort, refocus their attention on the speaker, and repeat in your head word for word what you're hearing. There are nonverbal ways to show that you're listening, which is eye contact and nodding. And lastly, do not interrupt until the speaker is finished.
Awesome, thank you. Are there any questions?
That's a good question. We could definitely pause recording for breakout so people have some privacy. I'll pause it right now.
Welcome back, everyone. And so I'll invite for some group reflections for you to share how it felt to be mindfully listened to. How did it feel to be mindfully listened to? And if there's someone who would like to unmute and share, that'd be appreciated.
I liked it. I thought it was, I've done it before in, other venues and so forth. But yeah, it was therapeutic for me, definitely helpful, and I appreciate the partner I was with. Very very interactive and good listener. So thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else want to share how it felt to be mindfully listened to?
Yeah, I felt that in telling my story to Alyssa, that she actually, with a lot of intention, listened to what the story was and was able to reflect it back to me exactly the way that I meant to transmit it. And that felt validating and empowering to me, that she had that talent and intention.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, this is Janelle speaking, and I completely enjoyed the assignment to be able to express the feelings, and I felt like I was totally not only listened to, but I was heard, because the colleague in my group completely threw back with a mutual example of her feeling not belonging. So I felt like I was heard, but I have to give you the credit for giving us the assignment. It was a great task.
I'm glad to hear that. I'm also seeing that it felt unrushed, especially considering that it was just there for a few moments. And seeing that.
Yes. Hi. This is Louise. In the room, it felt good because I'm not the only one with some of my feelings.
Yeah.
And getting in touch with my feelings, because sometimes you get in touch with your feeling and you're like, am I the one just feeling this way? But I see that now it's like universal, or you know what I'm saying? It makes me feel a little better that I'm not alone.
There's something in there of like finding community, of having a sense of, it's almost as if finding belonging does something for the body. Oh my gosh. How did it feel to be the person who was mindfully listening? I'm saying I wasn't focused on what I was going to say next.
I felt validated when I was mindfully listening to Louise's story. I felt validated.
Yeah. I find oftentimes, well, doesn't matter what I find. How does this feel different, or how might this be different from the conversations that you typically have throughout your day to day? How is it, or is it different?
Hi, this is Louise again. I feel that in the conversation that Janelle and I had, it was, maybe the word was really listening, focusing, not distracted. I had the word to say, but I forgot it. Another word, but it just felt like she said she was really listening to me and I was listening to her.
Yeah. I'm seeing in the chat, I felt a sense of connection, open, engaged, included. I felt it was important to listen well because my partner was going to reveal a challenging situation and I wanted to be as present as possible. There's something about that presence that allows us to be able to meet the true need of the thing that is being expressed and not what we assume needs to happen. We didn't talk about it today, but I find that the mindful practice for me rests on two fundamental questions. One, to be able to ask the question, how do I feel? And then two, to be able to answer the question, what do I need? And that somewhere in between the two of those questions, get to do some really exciting things. First, by checking in with ourselves, and then by acting. And not just a surface level check-in, but a deep one. One that gets beyond all of the mess that is going on, or the clouds that might be moving through our awareness, and into like the actuality of our experience. And so I have one more slide that I'm going to share with us because we're sort of like really wanting to be tools oriented today. And so I just want to talk about offering feedback. We draw a lot of inspiration from Rev. Angel Kyoto Williams. They identify as the Black Zen Buddhist change angel, and then is one of the architects of the MNDFL program. And they say that in that space of receiving feedback, you want to listen to feedback that is given. You want to be aware of your responses, to be open, to understand the message, reflect and decide what to do, and to follow up. And we're using it in the terms of like offering feedback, but this might also be most directly linked to that community agreement, that care agreement on call-in, and what it looks like to offer someone feedback depending on the impact of something that was said or done in the context of cultivating community. And in that space of giving feedback, you want to concentrate on the behavior and not the person. This does the work of separating also for the person themselves, the feeling from the experience. It gets us into that space of being able to distill lessons and not hold on to stories, right? As you're also continuing to give feedback, that you want to balance the content, to be specific and realistic, and to own the feedback. None of that I heard from no. If you're giving the feedback, you're owning it, or it's not yours to give. Not the same thing as accountability, I will say, but purposeful in the context of giving feedback. You want to be timely, and you want to offer continued support. And what happens here, it equalizes the relationship. It says that there is work for both the person who is giving feedback and the person who is receiving feedback to do, that there must be follow-up on the person who is receiving that feedback, and this continued relationship of support that is offered by the person who's giving that feedback. You don't just get to say what you want to say and walk away from it, because that is not how you exist in relationship with people as you're attempting to build this community. You put the person first and let the rest follow. And so I'll pause there, knowing that we have 4 minutes left to allow anything that is needing to be surfaced at this moment to come up. And if it is helpful for us to do this sort of like closing piece, feel free to allow anything that comes up in there to show up as well. But if there's one thing that was helpful for you today, one tool, technique, a thought, a word, a phrase that is going to sustain you or you're interested in putting into practice having left the space, what would that be? And this will help you sort of like move everything from body and mind through the hands into our Zoom chat. I'm seeing connection, presence. You want to know what books are on my desk? I have so many. Okay. Also happy to talk about them. The first one is To My Beloveds by Reverend Jen Bailey. She is the executive director of the Faith in Action Network, a great multi-faith, race-based space. What Now, a book written by Yael Shai, the previous executive director of the Center for Global Spiritual Life. It's a book about the purpose of mindfulness for folks specifically in their 20s. And then this last one, a book by Juliet Diaz that was recently released, The Altar Within, really great sort of like talk through on her personal journey to liberation through self-devotion. Books that come my way and I'm like, must read. And so they hang out on the desk until I skim them and move them on to my bookshelf over there. I'm seeing relationally is everything, self-awareness, being intentional with awareness and being present, and some gratitude for me sharing my books with you all. Thank you all so much for joining this portion of the talk. I hope truly that it will serve you in conversations to come. And if you have any questions or are interested in thinking through any of the things that were mentioned here further, I'm putting my email in the chat, and I'd be happy to talk to you all later. I'll turn it over to you, Matthew.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was amazing. Round of applause virtually. Really appreciate your time today, cultivating beloved community. And we'll definitely be in touch following up. I'm going to stop recording just to kind of close up shop.